You're all set and ready to go. I'll make my address.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for coming. I'm Tony Quainton. I teach here in SIS for those of you who are not SISers. And a long time ago, I had the privilege and honor of being the American ambassador in Peru. I did not then know Ambassador Castilla. He was, in fact, still an undergraduate at McGill University in Canada. But it's been a pleasure to get to know him here. He's had a very distinguished career as an economist. Not only did he work at a number of international lending institutions, including the World Bank, but he was then later chief of staff in the finance ministry, deputy finance minister over most of the last 4 years. And so what he's going to talk to you today about are some of the larger economic issues, multilateral issues that Peru has faced and is part of. And he's one of the architects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, well known to many of you. And so he speaks with real authority. He has his MA and PhD from another school down the street, I'm afraid, from Johns Hopkins, but we don't hold that against him, and indeed are honored that he would come and share his expertise with us. And please welcome Ambassador Luis Miguel Castilla.
Well, thank you very much for the kind remarks, Ambassador Quainton. Ambassador is very humble, but he's a very, very well-known and very well-regarded U.S. ambassador in Peru in a very difficult time during one of the most difficult years in Peruvian history. So thank you for inviting me and for having the pleasure to engage with you all. I actually, rather than being this a monologue, which may be a bit boring, it's better to engage in a conversation. But let me give you an area I'd like to explore, and then be open to any questions you may have, which is precisely, today the TPP was signed in New Zealand, or yesterday. And this has been a long process. And actually, let me put this in a broader context. Peru is a country that has done, since the time that Ambassador Quainton was in Peru in the late 80s or early 90s, has transformed itself dramatically. Just to throw you some figures, ever since the past 15 years, so even less of a shorter time horizon, we have more than doubled our GDP. We have multiplied our FDI 10 times. We have multiplied our trade 7 times. And more importantly of all, we've been able to reduce poverty from over 60 to around 20%. And we have been able to restore a middle class and an economy that was affected by terrorism, by hyperinflation, exactly during the time of the tenure of Professor Quainton. So all of this change and this progress, in which we've had, we've been one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America and among emerging markets, 6.5% growth on average for the past 15 years, like China-type growth, has several explanations. And I think one of them has been our openness, our insertion into the global economy. And this is good and bad. It's good when everything, is rosy, high commodity prices, capital inflows coming in, although that entails challenges. But it becomes, more of a challenge when foreign conditions, external conditions change. That's what we're seeing now in most emerging markets, and in particular in Latin America. The latest update that the IMF did a couple of weeks ago puts the region for a second year in a row in a recession. This is primarily explained by larger countries that account for a large portion of the region's GDP. But countries like Peru, like Chile, like Colombia have suffered from this slowdown, dramatic slowdown. from growing 6.5 to growing around 3%. And the prospect is that if we can get to 4%, it's going to be, successful. So this change in world conditions, our high dependence still in commodities, although we've diversified over the years, we see that deepening our insertion into the world economy may trigger and enable us to pursue a series of reforms that we otherwise wouldn't do. So let me go perhaps in terms of the TPP and perhaps even start with the broader picture, which is APEC. APEC, as you may know, is a group, a block of countries in the Asia-Pacific region, 21 countries that have been, working together for a long time now. And Peru, as a matter of fact, is presiding over APEC this year. So that's why I'd like to share some views. And the TPP really is a complement or a spillover, I think, of APEC. APEC we hosted APEC 8 years ago in Lima, and we're hosting APEC again this year. And the main issues that are going to be discussed is, beyond TPP, which is only 12 out of 21 economies, doesn't include China, for instance. How can we start drawing a blueprint towards a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, which would include countries such as China, which is quite, I understand, a very, very sensitive, country in U.S. politics, as you may know. Or other large countries such as Indonesia, Korea, which are not part of TPP, but are part of APEC. So in APEC, we're trying to, as host country, there is a continuity of themes that countries work along with their private sector. So it's a private-public partnership. And the areas that we work is how to facilitate trade, modernize our customs, reduce non-tariff barriers, how to be able to have more service exchange, service trade, how can we look more towards intra-industry trade and the participation of firms in supply chains. I think NAFTA, which is quite important for this country, and for Canada and Mexico, changed completely the Mexican economy, the pre-NAFTA and post-NAFTA. And I think a critical, ingredient of this transformation in Mexico, for instance, was the capability of Mexican firms to insert themselves in value chains with the US and Canada. So this is an area that is also that we're trying to work in our APEC discussions. Now, as a host country, we're trying to look at different complementary areas beyond trade. One important one is developing the adequate skills to be able to compete in a very competitive market, in a very competitive world, in which really innovation, skills, value-added knowledge is what makes a difference. A second area has to do with how to look not towards the big corporations, but to our small and medium-sized enterprises, our SMEs. How can we make them participate in these processes that are going on in trade and investment globally? And the third issue that our country is quite adamant is in trying to push the concept of food security. There's surplus countries, deficit countries, and there's issues of sustainability, market access, investment, infrastructure, food production, etc. And those are the themes that we're pushing this year while we host APEC. So this is sort of the broader engagement for many countries in Latin America. There is a strategic bet to insert ourselves towards Asia, as we see it as the fastest, most dynamic region in the world. And actually Peru has been pursuing, Peru and Chile and other countries are pursuing, have been pursuing for the past 20 years a series of free trade agreements with a lot of Asian countries and countries around the Pacific, Canada, from Canada to Chile, all the way to Singapore and Papua New Guinea, just to give you the broad picture. So TPP emerges from discussion that actually began with New Zealand and Chile, trying to have a free trade agreement and to be able to narrow the large gap in the Pacific Ocean, but with very similar-minded countries towards their openness. Trade as an engine of growth and development in both sides of the Pacific. And this began, and then the U.S. came along after this initiative that was led by New Zealand and Chile and Singapore initially. And now we have 12 countries that after 5 years of intense and I'd say very, very tough negotiation, we completed our trade deal in early October, and this is one of the top issues being discussed in your Congress. And it's one of the issues, perhaps, that I don't know whether it's part of the political agenda in the elections, but definitely is an issue that's going to be addressed in this country and in other countries. So the 12 countries of the TPP, in this side in this hemisphere, you have obviously Canada, the U.S., Mexico, you have Peru and Chile. So those 5 countries are the ones that are in this part of the world, and then you have very important countries such as Japan. TPP for the U.S., it's the bilateral trade agreement between the U.S. and Japan. It's their first trade agreement. So very important for the Japanese and for the U.S. firms. In our case, we already have a free trade agreement with Japan, for instance. We already have a free trade agreement with the U.S. That came into effect 6 years ago, and I had also the honor and the privilege to negotiate for my country at the time, 10 years ago. So this is a process of consolidating trade agreements, and this is obviously the largest attempt at a trade bloc which comprises over 800 million people, close to 40% of global GDP, and close to a third of global trade. So this is a very, very big, ambitious scheme. And talking to your dean before coming here, these agreements go way, way, way beyond trade and investment. It goes to different areas: environment, labor, institution building, different areas that you wouldn't think would be discussed in a free trade agreement. Let me give you my quick take on what I as a country, as a small open economy such as my own, what are the top 10 benefits from being part of TPP. And I'll dwell a little bit, and then I'll open it for the conversation that I promised. I would say, in our case, the top 10 benefits for Peru, and this is very important to go to the cost benefit and whether this makes sense for a country such as Peru. And here I was telling your dean and talking to different colleagues that when we were discussing the bilateral free trade agreement between Peru and the U.S., there was a lot of opposition. 90% of Congress, 90% or over 80% of public opinion were completely opposed to free trade with the U.S., completely opposed. And over the years, after 6 years of the treaty being in effect, numbers have flipped. The latest trade agreement that we had ratified in our own Congress was the Pacific Alliance, another interesting block which we can dwell on later on. But we've had 80% opposition for trade 10 years ago, or less than 10 years ago. We have now 80% of the public opinion and political support supporting, trade agreements. They're challenging because it's sometimes a zero-sum game. They're winners, they're losers. You have to really become more efficient to be able to reap the benefits from openness. But I think as a country we've matured, and we've been able to benefit from trade agreements. Otherwise we wouldn't really pursue them. And beyond the trade, it really makes us lock in reforms that otherwise we wouldn't do. If you compare the track record of closed economies to the track record of open economies, in terms of economic and social indicators, there is a clear differentiation. I'm going to be a diplomat, I won't mention names, but it is a fact that more open economies with less distortions, with no protectionist policies, with clear rules of the game of engagement, and that promote the free flow of trade, of goods and services, of capital, and of people, tend to do better than those that don't pursue such policies. So, going back to my top 10 benefits for Peru, and I'm going to be very quick. One is market access. Out of the 12 countries, we have trade agreements with 6 economies, and we are gaining 5 new markets: Australia, Brunei, Malaysia, New Zealand, and Vietnam. That's important because usually these countries are countries that demand our non-traditional products. They're not countries that are demanding our commodities. And we're in the process of an urgent need to diversify our economy, to be more resilient and less prone to have these shocks that affects us and slow our job creation when they happen. The second is that there are provisions that improve the conditions that we had agreed upon with existing trade agreements. We have a trade agreement with Canada, with Japan, and we've been able to get more market access with Japan, for instance, in sensitive sectors for them. The third is that for the first time, there's a chapter dedicated to SMEs. If you look at an economy such as Peru, 90% are small and medium-sized enterprises, over 90%. Therefore, and they are the ones really that generate the jobs. So the way that we are trying to make the SMEs participate in trade is through their insertion in value chains. And how do we do this? There is a concept in trade policy that is accumulation of rules of origin, which means that you can buy inputs from different countries, from the trading bloc, and you can export to a third country and accumulate. You have a shirt and you can buy the buttons in one country, the cotton in another country, manufacture it in Peru and export it to the US, or any combination you may think of. And so this is very important because it makes countries specialize in particular sectors, gain efficiencies, and be able to have a more integrated system. The Asians are doing a lot better today than Latin Americans because they've been able to develop integrated supply chains, different from the case of Latin America, or perhaps Mexico is the exception due to NAFTA. The fourth benefit for us is that we're streamlining a whole series of processes, because it's not only just opening markets, but it also has to do with non-tariff barriers. For us, and ever since I got here a year ago, we boast that we have a free trade agreement with the US, but it's been over 5 years that we haven't been able to have market access for our produce. Last time around, I think 4 years ago, we were able to introduce avocados into the US market. But there are sanitary and phytosanitary protocols that we have to meet, which can be very cumbersome and it's very micro issues that we need to work with. So streamlining these processes is a benefit. Going towards diversifying the economy, there is a promotion of e-commerce, software provision. There's a sixth benefit of capacity building, which is very important to be able to comply with the commitments that we are, we signed to, in environment, in labor, in other areas. We have provisions as a seventh benefit to protect our biodiversity and our traditional knowledge, which is very important for us. In the U.S., it's very important for the U.S. to protect their pharmaceutical industry. For us, it's very important to protect our traditional knowledge, that is, and have the adequate IP, intellectual property protection for such, traditional goods that come from our part of the world. The eighth is that we are able to sell to governments, to enter into their procurement processes, which is very important. In most countries, and Peru is the case perhaps in the US, the largest buyer of anything is the government, be it the central government, local governments, and this enables procurement. The ninth is that we can level the field for more service provision, for more call centers, for more engineers providing their services across countries. And I think the last one, the 10th benefit, is that this really deepens our strategic positioning in the Asia Pacific. So as a matter of fact, we are part of TPP. We're presiding over the Pacific Alliance this year. We're presiding over APEC. I mean, clearly it's an area of the world that is strategic for us. And we see this as a positive, and the good thing is that this has been upheld by different governments with different ideologies. And this is one of the areas, I would say, macroeconomic management and private investment as an engine of growth have been the three main pillars of Peru's transformation over the past few years. So with this, I leave you perhaps very focused on trade, but those are the areas that are being discussed. Those are the issues being discussed in this country. Obviously, it's the U.S. position. Are jobs going to be lost? How many jobs are going to be, lost to Vietnam, for instance? What are the labor standards in X country? Compliance of different issues. Those are the discussions that are taking place up the hill here, and this is really, I'm a firm believer in free trade. I'm a firm believer in fair trade, and of complying with high standards. It would be a lot easier not to have standards, not to have rules. It's a lot tougher when you engage and you commit to rules in terms of interacting with other countries and between firms. So thank you, and now I'm open to your questions.
If you have questions, please come to the microphone and the ambassador will take them, but it's good to use the microphone here so that we can all hear.
Hi there. I'm a student of the SIS. The question I had for you was, you spoke a lot about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and how it's going to help Peru. But from your point of view and inside Peru, is there like a fear as well of over-domination of the United States, especially in the fields of intellectual property rights and also macroeconomic management? Because we saw how, as a result of NAFTA, there was sort of this currency fluctuations in both Canada and Mexico, where the US dollar became stronger, and that thereby imports from the United States and other countries became more expensive for these countries. And also in the case of intellectual property rights, as you mentioned about some traditional knowledge which you want to preserve in Peru, don't you think for the free trade area happening over all these countries, there is a chance of Peruvian products not being indigenous anymore and being produced in other countries?
Well, thank you for your questions. Very, very sharp, and on the spot. All right. I think for certain countries, macroeconomic and exchange rate policy has been very important and a concern among your authorities and the Senate in particular. Not thinking about really the countries with whom they're negotiating now, but really thinking about future countries that may join in. One of the largest countries, most populated country in the world, for instance. So there's been attempts to have provisions to prevent currency manipulation, to artificially be competitive and not let the market determine your exchange rate. In our case, we have a flexible exchange rate regime, and I think in most countries that are party to the TPP, we have that exchange rate flexibility. Now, in our case, for instance, this hasn't been an issue because we have the flexibility, and on the other hand, there is very little that the government can do because we have an independent central bank that is in charge not only of having, meeting its inflationary target, but also in terms of avoiding the exchange rate volatility. But it's a market that determines exchange rate in our case. So there is not really much concerns really about the macro, or that's perhaps something that is more envisioned towards other potential future partners. Regarding the sensitive issues right on the spot, pharmaceuticals. And actually, this was when we negotiated our free trade agreement with the US, the bilateral one, this was one of the main issues that was discussed. And at the time, the belief was that there was going to be a hike in the price of medicines because of regulations in terms of data protection, etc. And as a matter of fact, that didn't happen. The average inflation, which is very low in Peru, was 3.3%, and during the lifetime of the during the past 6 years on average, and the inflation in pharmaceuticals was 2.8%. So that didn't happen when we negotiated the bilateral trade agreement with the U.S. Obviously, there's issues. It's a very tough negotiation. I think this, perhaps in this case, it was the toughest because the positions were very, very, very radical. Well, from 0 years of protection to 12 years. So, striking a balance is difficult, and also selling to your public opinion what is the value added of engaging in a new, more stringent IP policies that may or may not have effects on healthcare, for instance, or access to medicines. But I think our experience shows that that hasn't been the case. In terms of the traditional knowledge, I think it's precisely what we're being able to achieve is precisely have the same logic that you use for pharmaceuticals, apply them for traditional knowledge. Now, Peru is home to what we call uña de gato, which I don't know how you say it's a cat's claws or something like that, but it's an original tea that comes from Peru's and has all these properties, and we're trying to preserve that as something original from Peru, which has also its intellectual protection policies. So it's precisely that which enables really to have rules that will inhibit companies or countries getting that away without a proper return to the owners of that knowledge. So I think this is on the contrary. It really preserves and protects our biodiversity and protects our traditional knowledge.
Well, hello. First of all, thank you so much for being here. My name is Paola Beltran, and my question to you is, what is the biggest obstacle that you think in terms of development in Latin America?
Okay.
My question is a little bit more broad, I would say.
Okay, let me give you the three, because the one is a little bit difficult. I think I would say we've had a lot of progress in the region. Poverty has really dropped tremendously in most countries. We've created what it's been, I think, you Google the emerging middle class in Latin America, you're going to find a lot of returns. And we've been able to increase expectations of the population of social mobility. So I think the main challenge is to be able to keep on growing, generating jobs, and to avoid setbacks in the social progress that we've achieved. And you do that by generating jobs. And how do you generate jobs? Through investment. So I think that's one of the key challenges. The second one has to do with how to be more productive. You know, an economy grows either by investing more or being more productive. Basically, there's no magic to that. And I think productivity is very much linked to your skills, the human capital, if your markets work, your labor market works or not, if you have the right incentives, you know, to be qualified. And so I think productivity is really the appropriate infrastructure in place, human capital, physical capital. I think it's the second most important challenge. And productivity is tied directly to real wages and to better paying jobs at the end, which is really the source of welfare for most countries and for most citizens in countries. So I think that's the second one. So how to preserve, you know, the social gains and maintain them and keep on the progress, how to be more productive, which is tied really to the first one. And I think that the third one, I would say, I can add a fourth as well, is how to diversify our economies. You know, economies have been, especially countries in South America, because the reality in Central America and Mexico is rather different. But from the perspective of a country rich in natural resources, how can we leverage our development, you know, having a rational use of our natural resources? Now, you sometimes read in the news, in the media, about the social conflicts regarding extractive industries, for instance. And so striking the right balance between sustainability, extractive industries, committing to our climate change goals, and having, you know, being able to leverage towards a knowledge-based economy and diversify away from commodities, I think is a very important challenge for countries, which is also tied to the productivity issue. And I think last but not least is building more resilient and sound institutions. I think that is still one of the main agendas, reform agendas pending in most countries in Latin America. You know, there's corruption still persistent, you know, government effectiveness in delivering services, and we still have weak institutions. We've made a lot of progress, but I think still we need to do a lot more. So I would say those are the four things that I think at different degrees affect most countries, I would say in South America, primarily.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Byron Grant. I'm studying global governance here at American University. My question is essentially concerning foreign direct investments into Peru, but also investment outflows from Peru in the future. It certainly seems like from your lecture here today, what you've mentioned in terms of the past, I think, 10 or 15 years, your FDI flows, and also your, let's say, Sino aspirations regarding market expansion. You have these ideas about investment and how to place your country in a broader investment climate that the TPP will create. And that's great. I mean, it sounds like a really good agenda, very long-term one, but yeah, a good one. It also seems that you think that Peru has a competitive advantage over its immediate neighbors in South America with regards to that. And so I'd like to ask you to elaborate, if you think that's the case, why do you think that's the case? So what would a Peru watcher look for in Peru in comparing it to perhaps Mexico, perhaps not, as you mentioned, but more specifically, Chile and Colombia? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I think we're trying to sell this concept, and we've been quite successful. And this enables me. Your question enables me to talk a little bit about the Pacific Alliance, which is a very successful so far bloc in terms of real results. If you compare to previous attempts at integration in Latin America, the Indian community, Mercosur, haven't been that successful. But Pacific Alliance, in 3 years, we've been able to have more progress than in over three decades. And we find complementarities among the four countries, but still we compete. I mean, being quite honest. I think what distinguishes Peru from Mexico, from Colombia, I would say our strategic position right in the middle, geographical position right in the middle of South America, which makes for one of the busiest ports and airports and a hub destination. I think what distinguishes us from the countries you mentioned is the fact that we're still catching up, because we really had 3 or decades of really poor growth, and we were a laggard in Latin America. And there's this convergence. And there's still a lot of space to be able to invest in different sectors, retail, banking, you name it. In terms of certain areas of competitiveness is related to some of the costs of our inputs. Our labor costs, our energy costs are lower than some of our neighbors. So I think we need to improve. Still, having said all of that, we have to improve our competitiveness, the skills, close our infrastructure gap, and be able to invest more in R&D and try to really diversify, once again, our economy. But I would say our geographical position, these issues I've been mentioning that makes Peru competitive. And I think it's a country that has learned the lessons from the past and has been vaccinated from mismanagement of its economy. When Professor was there, things weren't that stable. We had hyperinflation. And for us, if the inflation gets above 3%, it's almost a crisis. It is. Or if growth falls below 4%, we are in a crisis as well. So I think this entrenched belief in the society that certain things such as macroeconomic stability, such as rule of law, such as openness, are things that in our society are becoming more and more entrenched. And this is a way how we can differentiate ourselves from our neighbors.
Hello. So you spoke about deepening Peru's strategic position with the Asia Pacific. I believe we are aware that RCEP is going to be entering its 11th round of negotiations in Brunei in just, I believe, a week, maybe a week and change. And I was wondering, hypothetically, should the U.S. fail to ratify the TPP in our Congress, would perhaps Peru be interested in either fully pursuing RCEP membership or ratifying an FTA with ASEAN as an initial step towards that?
No, I think it's going to be approved, of course. But I think this, when I mentioned the top 10 benefits, if I go back to the 10th benefit, which is the strategic, positioning in the Asia-Pacific area, for a country such as Peru, it would be really, something quite impressive that the U.S. wouldn't be part of this, given all that it's spent in terms of political capital, of mobilizing, a negotiation, very tough between two countries, imagine between 12 countries. It's very difficult. And they have pending the TTIP with the Europeans, perhaps next administration. So I think there's really a lot at stake not to have such an agreement, not approved. The question is when. And I think domestic issues come into play, which I won't comment on. So I think that regarding your question with ASEAN countries, now there is not really as Peru per se, but as a Pacific alliance, there is closer ties. Pacific Alliance has over 50 observer countries, and we have been developing talks with ASEAN countries. That means going towards the free trade area. I think our bet is towards TPP plus, because there are some ASEAN countries that are not part of the TPP yet. So I would say that's what I can say about your question.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Maria. My question is, do you believe that TPP negotiations were in part driven by the interests of multinational corporations?
I think the TPP negotiations are when one talks about TPP negotiations, you're talking about close to over 30 chapters encompassing different areas, as I mentioned: trade, investment, capacity building, SMEs, services, financial services, investor-state dispute, and on and on and on. So I would say there's been in this agreement a clear emphasis towards having more benefits be more evident for SMEs, precisely to be able to cater not only to large firms, but to all firms. So this is not something that only large firms benefit. No, because large firms are integrated with smaller firms and supply chains, precisely, and value chains. So I would say the focus of this agreement precisely has been to try to level the playing field for all firms, regardless of their size, and to encourage integration, between smaller, so that smaller can grow to be medium, and medium to grow larger. Obviously, that is it's more of where you stand, but I think the overall benefit of such an agreement is really beneficial for countries that already have these agreements bilaterally. So why bother going again, negotiating again with your partners when you already have the bilateral market access available? It's because this makes sense. This attempts to set high standards, the highest standards in different fields, and even higher than the ones we agreed upon last time around.
Thank you.
Thank you. Krista Bustamante, MA candidate for International Development. NAFTA on steroids has been one of the terms that the TPP has been categorized, at least in the United States, and one of the criticisms has been primarily around the ability for multinational corporations to supersede EPA laws or environmental protection in other countries. How is that debate playing out in Peru, and what are some of the strategies that Peru is having the debate to be able to protect the biodiversity that Peru has?
Thank you. That actually, along with SMEs, was one of the contributions of Peru to the discussion, to the negotiation, as a matter of fact. And actually, and we were talking also with your dean or with someone, I can't remember now, that quite recently that a lot of the environmental agenda now it's being attempted to be more enforceable and more complied through trade agreements, because there's mechanisms, there are sanctions, and there's ways that you can channel solutions when there are problems. So I would say actually that if you look at the climate change debate, which is a different debate, Paris reduction and CO2, fossil fuels, etc., energy and your efficiency in your energy matrix, clean energy, etc., sure, that's part of the agenda towards achieving sustainable development. But the other one is trying to set clear rules of the game for environmental standards and labor standards. So I would say it's quite the opposite. This is something that, of course, needs to be, you don't need to go into details. And now, actually, a country like mine, we're now discussing in terms of how effective we've been complying with our free trade agreement and environmental issues, for instance, which is good because we have a framework that is accountable, that's transparent, and you can really work towards improving your institutional framework and to comply and to preserve your biodiversity and your natural endowments. So I think trade is increasingly becoming a way to be able to enforce better environmental practices, actually. That's what I see in reality in terms of my discussions, for instance, with the US government and with civil society and with Congress. That's part really of my job here as an ambassador in Peru is precisely trying to outreach and trying to talk towards ways as partners to be able to cater to these challenges.
Gracias.
You know.
Good afternoon. My name is Leticia. I wanted to ask about the negotiation process itself. You mentioned that Peru is catching up after several macroeconomic challenges and institutional challenges as well. So how was it to share the negotiation table with powerful economies from the world? How did Peru prepare for this challenge? And if you could elaborate a little bit on your strategy on how you got your items in the list. Thank you.
Well, I wasn't in charge of the actual negotiations. We had people, experts, we just relied upon them. But I think one of the most challenging aspects of this agreement, which you won't see as much in the European agreement, is the asymmetries between countries. So you have the U.S. With a very high income per capita, negotiating with Vietnam, with a lot lower income per capita, below 1,000, and the U.S. above 50,000, or however way you measure it. So negotiating agreements with such diverse set of countries, it's a challenge. And really another challenge is for a country that already has bilateral agreements, how you can justify going the extra step. Now, what is the benefit from going the extra step, the extra standard? And that's something that is also a challenge in terms of the negotiation. But the good thing is I've become close friend with Ambassador Froben from the USTR. And we were just talking with my colleagues in the car coming here that the toughest first meeting I had when I arrived in Washington, very courteous, of course, was with the U.S. negotiator, because we were in the middle of a negotiation. But now we are partners. Once we've agreed upon something, we're on the same side of the table trying to defend the agreement that we both believe in, that will have benefits for our populations. Otherwise, we wouldn't really bother. There are other present developmental challenges that we have. And this is, one must not forget, this is not the end in itself. It's a mean towards an end, a tool towards getting better jobs, more formal jobs, and more prosperity, really, in the countries that are part of the TPP.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Corey. I'm an economics student, and my question involved TPP and the middle class in Peru. I know that that's a big talking point in the U.S. and what it's going to do to our lower middle class. And then my question was, you introduced, you said that Peru has been able to introduce a middle class in the last 15 years in the country. So what do you think the TPP is going to have? What kind of effect will it have on the middle class in Peru?
I think to the extent that we're able to generate more jobs and we're able to improve the skills of our labor force, because really to be able to bear the benefits, to reap the benefits of openness, you really need to invest in your people. You really need to reduce transaction costs. You really need to reduce logistic costs to be able to export. These agreements really are enablers for further change in countries. We cannot really persist having infrastructure gaps or the quality of our education being so low, because then we're going to be crushed, really, in a very competitive market. So this provides the right incentives to go well beyond trade issues. So I think the middle class is one that's going to benefit also from cheaper goods, the imports from the rest of the world, for instance. And the sectors that have been most benefited from trade with the US, for instance, have been sectors that are very labor intensive and where we have full employment, for instance, in parts of the region, south of Lima, Ica, where you have, the asparagus, you have the garment industry, full employment, something that 20 years ago was unthinkable.
These are the last 3 questions, by the way. Got to let the ambassador get away and do all these hard things that he's talking
No,
about.
this is great. I wish I could be here more time.
Thank you again for being here to talk with us. I am an undergraduate student here in SIS, and my question pertains to regulations on the pharmaceutical industry and the agricultural industry. One of the hardest negotiation points in the TPP for the US was the period of time that other countries would not introduce generic drugs into the American market for pharmaceuticals. The initial request by the US government was that there be a 10-year delay before these generic products are introduced. And through negotiations from especially the Peruvian delegation, they lowered it to 5 years. Once these 5 years elapse, either the American Food and Drug Administration will change its regulations to avoid conflict with the TPP's regulations, or there will be an increase in investor-state dispute settlements. Do you see that happening after those 5 years, or do you foresee less regulations being present and more free trade?
More free trade for sure. In terms of regulations, I think we need to adjust our regulations. In IP, for instance, when we signed the free trade agreement with the US, there were certain drugs that didn't exist in the market, biologic-related drugs, for instance, for cancer care, cancer treatment, for instance. It was more of the chemical-related drugs. So we need to, and there is a lack of regulation in terms of data protection in this area that we need to work, and we need to do. So I think it's not really adding layers of regulation. Quite on the opposite, streamlining existing regulations, and where there is absence of regulation, have it, but always with the intent of mobilizing, more trade, more investment among countries.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador, for being with us. My name is David Gallardo. I'm Peruvian and also student of law here in AU. In the last 15 years, our country have experienced a very interesting economical development and growth. I'm from the North Peru, and I would say that it's true what the ambassador said. We were experiencing those economic phenomena in the north, but there are certain negative voices in the North Peru also related to the lack of information about the implication of TPP. So based on that, and in order to be very clear, does the government have any plan to let the people in Peru, in the domestic level, know about the implications of the TPP?
Well, thank you for your question, because I think this is not only unique to Peru, but I think overall in the 12 countries, there was concerns about the transparency of the process in terms of the access of information to the public. But there's been, when you're negotiating an agreement, you're negotiating. So it's like you're playing poker with your friend. You don't show your, you need to really make sure that you're playing the game, because there are sensitive issues when you're in a negotiation. Notwithstanding that fact, for sure, there's been, during the negotiation period, because now everything is public access, everything is on the web page, you can really read at the USTR or the different trade ministries, all the chapters and all the analysis that that spill from those from different chapters, there were clear ways in which regularly organized industry and different interest groups had access to the most important decisions in the TPP. Obviously, you cannot really, while you're negotiating, you cannot really publish in the newspaper, all your, because you haven't, you really have to agree, and the negotiation really cuts the last night. Just to tell you an anecdote, we spent time with the appropriate ministers. The last negotiation was in Atlanta in October. And that night I didn't sleep because I was in New York with the president. The finance minister was on the other side, and the trade minister was in Atlanta. And we didn't sleep, and all the contentious issues were solved in the last 4 to 6 hours. And so therefore, this tells you sort of how difficult decisions you have to make, and these very delicate, balance. And these trade agreements must be seen integrally. If you only focus on one side, but come on, look at the other chapters and the other benefits. This is a general equilibrium exercise, not just look at the partial part. So I think there's been a disclosure, and there's been going to be a debate, and it's going to go through Congress. That will enable, a broad debate, and we're in democracies, so it's really what the majority wants. And I'm quite confident that most countries, hopefully all countries, will approve the TPP.
Last question. Hi, my name is Yu Zhao, working in the Public Citizen Access to Medicine program. I can understand, regarding to biologic measures, because Peru doesn't have those measures, so you want to adopt some regulations to regulate that. But aren't you worried about it will restrict Peru to buy cheaper version of biologics, like biosimilars for your people, for Peruvians? It will limit Peruvians to access to the newest drug, because biologic is very critical for cancer disease. And for Peru, in 2014, you're spending 200 million on pharmaceuticals and 17% on biologics. After 10 years, the transitional period, after you adopt the TPP provisions, then the biologic, the government spending on the biologic will increase, and the people's spending on biologics will increase too. So how you see that provision would benefit Peru in some way?
I think the most expensive medicine you can have is the one that you don't have access to. And really, this enables access to medicines that otherwise you wouldn't have. I mean, it's very, crude, but that's the reality. And I think, this is a sensitive issue for us. And we negotiated, very, tough to maintain the same standards. So we had agreed upon during our bilateral agreement with the U.S. And I think we were able to have these landing zones, how they call it in the jargon of negotiators, enough time so that we could, adapt our regulatory framework, and to make sure that there was no increase in the costs of such medicines. Again, I go back to this same discussion 6 or 7 years ago, when the trade agreement with the U.S., the same exact issue was flagged. And it didn't happen. Now, obviously, biologics is not the same as chemical-related medicines. But I think we've achieved a balance that enables access to appropriate medicines and without higher costs in the medium term. And this is something that we are quite sure, and we've done the studies that prove this. But this is a very sensitive issue, and perhaps I bet this is the most discussed issue in our Congress when it comes to discussing this bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please join in thanking the this, and we look forward to welcoming you back to continue this discussion to see how it in fact progresses in our own political system against your very wise and thoughtful remarks about the problems and the benefits that are inherent in the agreement. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.